Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and let's take a look at domain and range. So, domain. Domain is a special word in mathematics, and it is going to represent the set of all the x values that make sense for our graph. Now, and you're going to have to learn that. That's a new word, domain. And it means the set of all the x values that make sense for our graph. What about range? Home on the range. No, not that range. So this will be the set of all the y values that make sense. With the deer and the antelope play for our graph. Where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and we like to do math all day. Hey, there you go. All right, domain, the set of all x values. Range, the set of all y values. Integers are going to be all of these guys. -3, -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2, and a 3, and they keep going into the negative direction, and they keep going into the positive direction, and you'll notice that there are no fractions. And you will notice that there are no decimals. All right? Real numbers. Real numbers are different. Real numbers are all the numbers we work with. I think that's a good enough definition for us. So that includes all these guys, all the integers, plus the decimals and fractions. Okay? So all the numbers we deal with. Now, we have a special symbol for the real numbers. It's very, very complicated. It is a 2 lines down and a fancy R, and it stands for real numbers. And we have a fancy symbol for integers. It's a fancy looking I. Now, depending on the font that you're using, those things look different. But basically, it's a R for real numbers and an I for integers. And if I want to say that x is a member of the real numbers, so if x is a real number, what I say is x, a fancy E type like that, and the symbol. So that says x is a real number. And if I want to say that x is an integer, I say x is an integer. And so those are the symbols we use, and that's what's expected. So let's talk about domain and range of each graph. So this graph here that I have is supposed to just be a bunch of dots. A dot, a dot, a dot, a dot, and those dots represent these points. 2, 1, and 3, 2, and 4, 3, and 5, 4. Now, they stop there. There's only those 4 dots. Now, the domain is going to be all the x values that make sense to our graph. Domain. All the x values that make sense to our graph. So that's an x value, that's an x value, that's an x value, that's an x value. They all make sense to my graph. So I say 2, 3, 4, and 5. And these are brace brackets. You need to kind of practice them. They take some time. And you don't have to be perfect, but you got to try. And they mean the set. So this says the domain is the set 2, 3, 4, and 5. Those are all the x values that make sense for this graph. Now what about the y values? What are the y values that make sense for this graph? Well, first of all, it's called range. and it's going to be the set of all 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Yay! So, you now have domain, you now have range for a set of points. That is so cool. Let's look at the next one. So this is a bunch of points. There's a dot here, a dot here, a dot here, a dot here, and this is supposed to indicate that it keeps going and going and going, just like the Energizer Bunny. So it's dot, 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 dot. So if I was to try to write these out, it would be -1, 2. It would be 0, 2. It would be 1, 2. It would be 2, 2. And it would be dot, 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 forever and ever and ever and ever more. I obviously could not write out all of the numbers that belong on this graph. Okay? They're just going to keep going. So I need a way of talking about the x value, -1, the x value 0, the x value +1, the x value 1, all of these x values, and it keep going. So what we do is we use domain is going to be the set of all x that's greater than or equal to -1. So starting at -1 and going all the way up and only using the integers. Okay? We're not going to use any of the decimals or the fractions in between. Now look at the range. The range is 2. The range is 2. The range is 2. The range is kind of boring here, guys. Range is the set of 2. Just by itself. It's just one thing. That's it. That's your range. I'm done. We're out of here. Okay, let's flip over. Now we have a line segment, part of a line. There's a dot here, an endpoint, and an endpoint here. So let's think about this for a minute. My domain are all the x values that make sense for this graph. Well, -2 makes sense for this graph, and 4 makes sense for this graph. Everything, all of the x values between here and here make sense for this graph. All those x values. So how are we going to say all the x values between -2 and 4? Well, I think we could say -2 is the lowest number. X must be bigger than or equal to -2, and x must be less than or equal to 4. Now remember, you want to do this from the center. Read from the center, not left to right like we do in English, but from the center. X is greater than or equal to -2. X is less than or equal to 4. And since all the decimals and all the fractions are included, x is an element of the real numbers. That's kind of cool. Let's talk about the range. So the range tends to go from 2, way up here, to -3, way down here. So the range is going to be all of these numbers. So how do we say that? We say range is the set from -3, the lowest value, y this time, not x, up to 2, and y includes all the fractions and decimals, and that is that. Isn't that great? That's amazing. That's awesome. Look at the next one. Let's put a big dot here at the 2 so that this is easier to do. So I've got half of a parabola maybe. Okay, and it keeps going and going and going and going down. So my domain, all the x values that make sense. 0 makes sense, and it keeps going and going and going because this keeps going and going and going. So domain is going to be the set of all x, but they got to be bigger than or equal to 0, and it's going to include all the decimals and all the fractions. And your range is going to be y must be less than or equal to 2 for all the same reasons as above, because it's going to keep going that way. as this keeps falling and falling and falling. And the last one, last but not least, we got a nice little quadratic here. We got a little vertex here. It's going to be opening up. It's got cute little arrows on the end. Isn't it so cute? Okay, so the domain. Domain. I don't have a song for that. All right, so the domain is all the x values going this way. All the x values going this way. It's going to continue and continue and continue. How do I say x is going to be every single number? Well, I simply say x is an element of the real numbers, which means it can be any number at all the decimals, all the fractions, all the integers. What about the range? The range is not so forgiving. The range has a lowest value it can be. There's a lowest value of y. So range is going to be y must be greater than or equal to 0, and y is an element of the real numbers. Ladies and gentlemen, that is it. You now understand domain and range. Go forth and do your homework.